Hello, friends. Um, it's 10 o'clock ish, and we have a whole lot of issues on the list, including some blocking ones, which we probably won't get past, but let's hope for the best. First up today, MECM memory cache, add read only span of char, get API. This is runtime 110504. Welcome in,
Okay,
Mark.
so the gist here is as part of some overall caching work in .NET 10, including and not limited to hybrid cache, we want to see if we can slam together the new alt lookup features on dictionaries and the new interpolated string handler capabilities. The key point being here, it would be nice to have a world where we can do so an awful lot of caches, including memory cache. A lot of the time they're based on strings at the moment, and it'd be very nice to be able to do the in the kind of hit path when you're getting values out. It'd be nice to do that without actually allocating the string. And it turns out that we can actually do that if we add one API or potentially two APIs. Um, so that's what this issue is basically getting down to. Um, so the proposal, there's a bit of a discussion here because there's two ways we could do it. But if you see the first bit in green there, where we've got the simplest way we could do this would be to add a new. So there's at the moment the API on memory cache has a try get value that takes an object key. And internally, we check whether that's a string, and we write the strings one way, and everything else writes another way. That means we get all the string rebalancing goodness. But because that's object based at the moment, it's we can't do anything kind of more efficient than that. So the proposal here basically is to add something string like to the try get method, and we only need it really on the hit path, the kind of the speculative we're expecting a value path. So the idea here is to add this method, for example, the try get value that takes a read only span of char for the key and returns the untyped value out. And potentially there is also an extension method on the existing memory cache APIs that has a basically generic form of the same thing. So that's this try get value T item. So at the moment, those two methods map one to one with methods on the existing API that take an object key. That is one way we could do it, but it wouldn't necessarily be. So that's really simple, but it wouldn't necessarily give us the best usage because people would still need to do a lot of work to actually get hold of that span. It wouldn't be intuitive to users how to actually use that. We can go one step further. If you scroll down a little bit to the second proposal. So this is the decision alternative, um, where basically instead of actually having a read-only span of char key, we have the very similar API, but we actually take a ref default interpolated string handler as the key, and that is the inbuilt one that's used by Roslyn by default, and that is recognized as an interpolated string handler. And the nice thing about that is if you either in new code or in pre-existing code, if you had a memory cache object and did a dot try get value, and then you did your dollar quotes foo brace ID brace, put all your different templates in, then the compiler will do all the work there to actually build the string-like value using exactly the same logic as the compiler would normally if you're passing in a string, and it will then pass that uh, that ref struct into the method, and we would do all the work inside to safely get the value out and make sure everything's recycled correctly. So that second alternative API with the default interpolated string handler, it looks more complicated, but it gives most users a lot more gives us a lot more bang for the buck in terms of that API. Then is really kind of really simple to use. Um, that's kind of the main gist of it. There's an awful lot of words and discussion around what we actually do with those values behind the scenes. Hence all the kind of discussion above about using the the try get alternate lookup and all those things. But at the API level, um, what I'm really trying to do is add one of those two things. And if we do that, then we can do get uh, a very long way. Um,
Can I ask a question, Mark?
Please do.
Are
I know
there,
you're familiar with this stuff. We discussed this at length already.
yeah,
Yeah.
one thing we didn't cover, and it's something you said just made me think to ask. I- for cases where you don't get a hit immediately, is there like a fallback path where you actually need the string?
Uh, yes. So I would imagine that in the full. So I'm not proposing adding a kind of a get or create style method on memory cache or doing anything there. So my expectation would be that in the miss case, that the caller would need to do the work to kind of get hold of the string and
Oh, so
materialize that.
the caller would rather than the implementation. I was asking because I haven't actually tested, but um, it's if there's an existing try get value that takes an object key, and now we add one that takes an interpolated string handler, or actually if we just add one that takes a read-only span of char, I don't actually remember. Oh, maybe this is why you put overload resolution priority.
It is, yes,
Oh no, but
yes.
no, you put overload this would prioritize it. So in the case where you needed a fallback, where you actually needed the fallback to the string, you'd actually be increasing allocation in the case where someone had a string because the string would implicitly convert to read-only span char, but then when you needed the string under the covers, you'd have to two string it, and so you'd be allocating a string in the case where they already had one. But if that's not a scenario, if you don't actually ever need
In
to
that
do
first
two
API,
string,
yeah,
yeah, if you don't ever actually need to do two string, then that wouldn't be an issue.
correct. So yeah, we wouldn't ever actually materialize the string in this path, even in a miss. And the main well, there are ways people can use this directly with memory cache, but the scenario I'm particularly thinking of this is actually coming through from the hybrid cache side of things, where again it's doing all the extra steps to wrap um, how the what to do if it doesn't actually get found,
And for the hybrid
materializing
cache
that.
case, the it's creating a span or the span is being passed through from the user and hybrid cache wouldn't need to do a two string.
Uh, Sorry, say that again.
I'm just trying to understand if we would actually be possibly making things worse in some cases. So, and the answer might quite possibly be no. I just want to check. So I'm trying to understand with hybrid cache, is there a situation where the user might pass in a span, but hybrid cache would need to dot two string it?
Yes. So in the miss well the in hybrid cache, the target scenario for this, they would actually be passing in some interpolated string handler. The tricky thing there is, and this might actually make it a better idea to use the first API, the span version, is what we don't want to happen is we try and do the L1 lookup on memory cache, and that effectively burns the uh, interpolated string token because they've got very weird single use semantics. So in some ways, having the char a char API on memory cache may be preferable there, but uh, yeah, and that doesn't cause any additional allocations, even if it does, even if they do have a string, because it'll just do the lookup
Right. So
however
as
it
long
can.
as for the first one, for the span based one, as long as memory cache won't need to two string it, that's fine. I just wanted to double check there was no like first try with a span and then fall back to using a string in some situation.
No,
Okay.
we're assuming the well that really comes down to, is there ever a situation in the runtime where we would expect uh, the alt lookup to not exist? That's really the driver for that.
I mean,
Um,
yes, it depends what a quality compare you provide.
So, well, memory cache, it doesn't allow you to specify that, so it would be the default ones.
So what
We
does it
control
use?
that in
What does it use?
default.
Oh, so like a quality compare of t dot default.
It doesn't pass a comparer in. It did. That was actually recently changed a few weeks ago. So now it does not. When it creates the concurrent dictionary or whatever it is, it does. It no longer. There you go. Uh, I believe that has changed very recently, so it does not
Okay,
do
but
pass in the compare.
either it doesn't provide a comparer at all, or it provides one that's either a quality compare string dot default or maybe string compare dot ordinal, which all have the same
Yeah,
semantics and all support the alternate lookup.
yeah.
Um,
Or if it hasn't merged already, there is a pull request out that changes those lines of code that you're looking on. But yes, it's either the default implicitly or explicitly.
and we don't imagine that changing in the future.
No. So that would be the only situation where we would need to materialize, and we wouldn't add, obviously we wouldn't add this API on any runtime where we don't expect alt lookup to exist. We wouldn't backport the API.
Wait, so you're saying you don't think there's a future where you'd specify compares for memory cache? Is that
No,
okay?
because at the
Um,
moment, oh, I'm sorry.
all right. So at the beginning, sorry if it's a bad time to kind of cut in with a new thing. Let me know. But like at the beginning, you said that it sounded like you were going towards the screen, the alternative proposal, the string interpolation, as like your preference, and now it seems like you prefer the read-only spanner car, and I just
I've,
missed that. Sorry.
yeah, no,
What
I've
was the
almost
reason?
rubber ducked myself. So the reason I'm doubting myself there, and I may need to go and have another look at the API and the implications, is it comes down to how when we burn if we use the default interpolated string handler, the expected use of that because of the internal pooling and recycling is that that is passed in and burned inside that method and not used again afterwards because of in the simple use where you just did a try get value. Say we had this API, the second API, and we did a try get value, and you passed in some interpolated string with dollar and quotes and all the braces. Um, the compiler does not call reset after that method. So the expectation is if you pass something in as a ref default interpolated string handler, the method internally must do the cleanup. So and we can't copy a default interpolated string handler because of again all the pooling. So my concern there now, thinking about it, is that if we did that in hybrid cache, then the moment we did the L1 lookup, we've burnt the key and we can never use it again because it's been uh, recycled, and I believe it resets everything to basically says this equals default at the end, which would mean that if we get an L1 miss, we would no longer have a key to fetch. So in some ways, I'm actually thinking about it and rubber ducking against yourselves. I'm I'm thinking it may be better to keep things simple and use the span based version for precisely that reason. But I'm happy to take guidance and input on that, especially from Stephen, I guess, is probably going to be most familiar
I
with
would,
this area.
even without that, I would have opted for the first one just because it's simpler and involves
Yeah,
fewer moving parts and is
yeah.
easier to reason about. Um, and if you have a string or a span, you don't have to do anything special to use it. Whereas there's no implicit cast from a string or a span to an interpolated string handler, so you'd have to do the $ quote dance to.
Well, the API that takes object already exists. So if you had a string today, you
Sure,
wouldn't
it
have to
wouldn't
do
work with
that. You would
span,
just call try get value and you pass the string, and
but not with
it
span,
would just do the type test.
right? But not with span.
No,
Span,
no.
you could, yeah.
So if you wanted to do a slice, for example, if you had a string and you wanted to do a slice operation, then yes, you could do that with this first version,
Right.
which is nice.
So another big question, I think, if we're worried about like the usability of this API, and I know Mark that like this is mostly for hybrid cache, but like most people using this type directly are probably going to use it through the interface, right? So like none of this like overload resolution priority stuff is going to matter if you're using it through
Yeah,
the interface.
we can't, and there's not a lot we can do on the interface. I wasn't proposing adding any new extension methods on the interface. There are a number of methods that are have been added to memory cache that are now only available via type testing to memory cache, such as the access to the dot keys and a couple of other APIs. So there's precedent there um, for that, and the fact that this is a uh, I think this has out of band support down to older and more generic runtimes. So it's not like I don't think we can use like we can. I don't think we can do anything with like default interface methods or anything like that. So from I think the simplest thing, the most pragmatic thing to do is to just stick to the memory cache API. But then you're right. If somebody is using iMemory cache, they won't get any new goodness, and
Yeah.
that's I'm okay with that myself. That's like if you want the new thing, you need to.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just wanted to call it out. And then like the last thing is like you're obviously aware of because you put in the existing APIs is the existing memory cache doesn't have generic methods. It's an extension method. So this would be like the first generic method on the type, which I don't know is particularly bad. It's just kind of weird. Um,
Yeah, so I think the reasoning for that is because it doesn't actually need anything memory cache specific. So it was added as an extension method on iMemory cache, I think because it could be, and it made perfect sense to be, because you're just doing you're just doing a try get value and a cast. Um,
What does the try get value that's generic do if the value doesn't isn't a T item but exists?
I believe it faults.
It
Oh,
returns
that's an
false.
existing that there's an existing generic.
extension
don't.
method. Yeah, can you scroll up to the existing APIs, Jeremy?
Uh, yeah, but I had already looked this one up, so I have the
Okay.
better answer, which is code where it's incorrect and it returns false for two reasons.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong. That's fine.
It only returns true if the value exists and is null or the right t.
I like the way you described it better, Mark. But yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, I would propose that if we do add the generic version, we would use the same semantics as is done there, which is that's actually not the way I remember. I thought it through, but that's fine. That implementation is
Throwing would be better, but it is what it is.
Yeah, we
yeah,
should, regardless of what we would want it to do, we should match what it currently does.
yeah.
I see.
But yes, for shape, it's those.
But the overload resolution priority is actually needed. I tested that because at the moment, if you do pass in, it does get
If you pass a string,
unhappy.
it'd be ambiguous, right?
Yes, exactly. Uh, Although if you're passing a string, I guess we don't care which one it goes. If we use the span one, it's going to avoid doing a type test, which is probably worth doing. So it's probably worth preferring that one just to avoid a if key is string s.
Well, I mean, that goes back to the what's the likelihood that during the evaluation of try get value that you'll have to call key.toString, because if it's non-zero, then you probably want strings to prefer to be objects, and if it's zero, then you want to prefer them to be spans.
True. Um, so that's how we got into the discussion of whether it always uses the default comparer, which it does,
Yeah.
because that's controlled internally. That's not There's no API to specify your own comparers.
Do we care about any of the other extension methods like get or create, like optimizing those?
I don't think we do because behind the scenes, anything that's well, maybe not an in-place mutate, but the anything that's going to add is going to end up having to materialize a string from a span anyway. Um, I see diminishing returns on anything that isn't just the the kind of the fast path. If people disagree and think we should add, particularly an in-place mutate API, we can consider that. But it gets tricky because the API behind the scenes is it's all this iCache item, and it's a bit more complicated actually adding things to the cache.
Right. So
It's
I
not
mean, the
as
get or
simple as that.
create or like set wouldn't make sense because you're going to have to manifest it into something you can save. But
Yeah,
for get or create, that would be the if the get would still be able to do the alternate lookup, and then if that returns exists, then you didn't have to manifest the object. And but when you move into the set path, then you would have to. It's the same thing that
yeah,
alternate lookup has. It's once it needs to save in the dictionary, it needs to call the go turn yourself into the other kind of object.
yeah. And we get that from the hybrid cache call path. We have that problem twofold because we also need to talk down to distributed cache, which is again string based. So yeah, we're it's yeah,
So the
it's
fact that
fun.
you exist in older frameworks means no matter what, you don't want to use default interpolated string handler. Um,
Okay, well, I'm going to consider that second one nuked.
okay,
That we prefer the simple read-only span.
okay,
So that was the key thing there. That also avoids the question. There was a question as that if we were going to do an interpolated string handler, do we use the default interpolated string handler, or do we use a custom one? But we don't need to have that conversation if we're not going to use the interpolated string handler. Um, and there's a follow-on set of changes relating to the API that we actually expose in hybrid cache, but I would propose we punt that for now and we just worry about getting the memory cache bit in if we can with just these try get value on with the read only span of char, and I'll worry about the hybrid cache side of things again.
If we wanted to, we could always expose, like we do the try get value with a span now. We could always add an extension method in the future that took a default interpolated string and just delegated to the span one, right?
Yes.
So in
uh,
that sense, they're not they're complementary.
right.
Yeah,
So
we don't
the
have extension methods for memory cache currently, but I mean we could, I suppose. Just add as like a normal method too,
We have
right?
them for iMemory cache, but not for memory cache.
Right.
Correct.
Or I could say someone could always add an extension method.
I
Like
see.
yeah, like someone could enable that syntax if they wanted to and get the efficiency of using the span-based implementation.
yeah,
That
the
makes sense.
default handler, the only way to get the value out of it is to call toString and clear.
Well, there's
No,
a
there's
PR
a
that I
there's
have pending for the
But
last 3 weeks that implements the API we approved that adds the text property.
right, but that wouldn't let it work on net standard.
Well, no, but these APIs aren't for net standard either.
This package
Right?
is in net standard.
I thought you said you were proposing this just for
Yeah, I was proposing these changes would only apply.
because the alternate lookup stuff that this relies on doesn't exist on net standard. So
Yeah,
we would be
it
adding
only
APIs
exists
to
.NET
net
9
standard
upwards.
that would
Okay.
be problematic perf-wise.
So that would be .NET 9 and above for the try get alternative lookup.
Fair enough.
Other than that, seems fine. It's a little strange to be adding, something that takes an object key to be adding a span of char specialization. But if strings represent the like 95% use case, which it sounds like they do, then seems okay. Do you have a sense of like what do people use? Is it like literally everyone uses strings, or do some people use GUIDs or integers or
The other problem is in the cases where people do use value type. It'd be nice to be able to use like value tuples and things like that, but then you get into boxing. I know there's is it rcache where they're talking about some kind of T key based cache, but this is a far more established thing. But yeah, most of the time, when I see cache used, it's with string keys, purely because they're trying to compose multiple values in, and there's no good ways of doing that that don't involve either boxing or strings.
I guess unless, I mean, in the future, if we were to allow a comparer to be supplied to memory cache, you could imagine making it work by having like allowing that comparer to implement an alternate comparer for their T key. But
Well,
that
well,
raises the
yeah,
question
but
of where do you,
I
sorry,
don't
go
think
ahead.
we'd ever do that in memory cache because it doesn't it's a grab bag that's often registered once and has all kinds of keys
I see.
from disparate systems all at the same time.
Got it.
So it's not as localized as most dictionaries.
I see. And there's no concept with memory cache of, oh, I guess we're only getting, so never mind. I was going to ask, there's no concept of enumerating, but we're not adding here. We're only getting, so it wouldn't be storing the spans anyway.
No, we're correct. It would we don't try and store the spans. There is a mechanism to iterate the keys, but that enumerates the two underlying collections and just gets the values out of there. There'll be strings no matter how they've been put in. Sorry, no,
And
yeah.
and if
Move
in
on
the
to the
future we ever
strings.
wanted to
These ones are the
change,
strings.
if in the future we ever wanted to change the implementation, we would just need to make sure that we keep the span-based alternate lookup working. But that's fine. We can. It would just we'd have to, it would constrain our implementation a little bit, but probably never
Well,
gonna
string
happen.
is already special cased anyway because of the to try and enforce uh, the dictionary t-string specializations that exist. String is such a weird case because of Marvin and all that stuff. So
I see. Okay, seems fine to me. I assume the names here, key and value, match what we do, and try get value, like that. Those are all the same names that we currently have for memory cache and
yes,
non-memory
so
cache.
the API in the paragraph above on screen, I believe that's copied directly out of the code. So those names all match.
And for either of these, is there ever a situation? Oh, I think in the code we saw the answer is yes. Is there ever a situation where it returns true and sets value to null? And I think the answer is yes, and therefore we can't use any special attributions on them to for nullability.
Uh,
The current code returns true if value is null.
Okay.
So
So
the
then these are right the
but
way they
null
are.
is valid.
the annotations here match. So this matches what I see in the code on my other screen, and
Okay.
this matches that modulo extension method turning into instance method.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
Steve, do we have guidelines on overload resolution priority? Are we doing
Use it
one?
when necessary.
Are we being like basic and skipping by
Well,
tens or
well, we don't actually have to worry about that because it's a local thing. It doesn't apply across like type definitions. So you just have to keep it locally consistent. And if in the future we ever add one more here, we would revise all of the ORPA attributes on the type.
it
Wait, would it not matter if someone had like an extension method with
Correct.
instance
It does
methods
not.
always beat extension methods.
And it doesn't. And if two people have extension methods, it doesn't like the ORPAs on them don't apply.
Does ORP
Well,
apply through
see, I would
derived
have
types?
thought that, right? Like you said, instance methods always beat extensions methods, but wasn't the whole reason we needed overload resolution priority for the generic try get value is because like string conversion or something?
But that was wasn't that on like there's a try get value that takes object on this type.
Yeah, it's to resolve against this one.
I see. Not against the extension method.
The generic one shouldn't need the attribute actually, only the out
Well,
object
Mark
one.
said he tested it, and the generic
Uh,
one did need the attribute.
I certainly needed it on the instance one. I can double check that if there's any doubt.
I mean, I don't think it would hurt to have it. But if assuming memory cache is not sealed, if someone extended it, does the overload resolution priority run across the derived types unified
I'd
method
have to
group, or is
I'd
it
have
layer
to
by
test
layer?
that or ask Fred, who'd probably have to test it.
Okay, and so I mean that's just the that's sort of the do we do VB level skip by tens? Sorry, not VB,
I think
basic skip by 10, or are we just doing ones?
I mean we could
Taking
revise
back
this, but
a
we
few years.
basically said the ORPA value is not part of the contract. It's something that we
Okay,
revise at will.
okay. And it looks to me like the getter creates are actually only extension methods right now. Stefan
Correct.
asked earlier if we should do getter create, and I wrote down that we decided not at this time. They, I think, are currently only extension methods on the interface, and then presumably, if we cared, we'd move them to instance on the type. I just had data in front of me, so I shared it.
And if we do ever add the getter create, we'll just need to factor in the fact that it's going to need to toString, which means we want to use different ORPA values.
Right, because if you had a in that one, if you had a string, we'd want you to prefer it stay a string.
Right. We'd want to bind to the object overload.
Yeah, so you'd want to be -1 instead of 1.
Right.
Trippy.
Or you just add take away the orp attribute completely and just have a try add an overload that takes a string. But then you're overload. I guess having two methods with attributes is better than having four methods.
Yeah, and you also need to consider other things that are reference types that also have an implicit conversion to span, like char array.
Yeah.
Alright, we're passing on interpolated string handlers. We do need overload resolution priority. And
And this is
we're not doing
this
getter
is
create
not
at
for
this
down
time.
level. Well, I guess it's down level to .NET 9, but not beyond that. Or presumably .NET 8. All right, it's .NET 9 plus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, namespace. That's what I was looking up. All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Alrighty. Round 2 of introduce logging, sampling, and buffering. This is extensions 5123.
Yeah, just a quick update. So I have addressed all the existing feedback from first first round, right? Uh, yeah, and I don't know where we should continue. Like, should we start over again? Like, or should we continue from the point where we stopped last week?
I think anything that we finished before, unless there was an outstanding question or you changed it from what was written down in the meeting, we don't need to talk about again. We could just start it where we haven't talked about yet.
Okay, yeah, let's continue.
So I don't know where we should be.
Yeah, scroll down to buffering part, and I think we finished global buffering and just about to start HTTP request buffering. Yes, from here. So the context was that global buffering is used for like non-request logs, and HTTP request buffering is used for logs where, or like when there is an active HTTP request and there is HTTP context available.
The logging builder that you get back there, are there I assume there aren't objects that you're using that are strongly typed and that implement both iLogging builder and something else where request buffering might be confusing. Like when you do .add HTTP request buffering, you'd only ever be in a situation where you were obviously in the context of logging. Otherwise, request buffering could have a very different meaning.
Yeah, yes, so like we don't have anything on iService collection, for example, so it is only iLogging builder. So the context is logging.
But there's no, just to be clear, there's no like foobar builder type that implements iLogging builder and implements HTTP client builder or something like that where this could be confusing. It's probably more of a question for Stefan.
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
So,
What was the question?
I just want to make sure. So this, I'm going to be dotting off of something and calling add HTTP request buffering, which if I had an object that wasn't obviously specific to logging, this could be confusing because right there are other APIs and Microsoft extensions that provide a different kind of that provide HTTP support, and this could be a request buffering could be about actually buffering the request stream. So I just wanted to make sure there's nothing that you get back from any API that might be like a foobar builder that happens to implement both iLogging builder and iHTTP whatever builder, where this could start to be ambiguous or confusing.
Yeah, well, that kind of thing is not unheard of in ASP.NET. I don't think we have anything that would be confusing with
Okay.
iLogging Builder. So
Okay.
I understand the question, but yeah, I think this is fine.
Yeah, so, I mean, Steve, are you just preemptively suggesting that the word log should appear between request and buffering?
Not if this is only not if you would only ever get this on in the context of logging where it would be sort of implied, but without that context, well, I mean, maybe even with that, I don't know. Maybe it would make sense to add logging just because I don't know, HTTP request buffering. I would never think that that had to do with logging.
Yep. And with the propensity of the ASP startups to be just giant strings of Cascade Fluent calls and var, I would definitely agree. It would probably look like you're doing request buffering and not request trace buffering.
okay, so what is the suggestion just to add the log?
Like if we added the word log between request and
Yep.
buffering, for example,
request
add
log.
HTTP request
Yeah.
log buffering or something like
Okay.
that. Just to make clear, like what is it that you're buffering? You're buffering logs, not buffering the request.
Okay, makes sense.
So chat has asked, what makes HTTP special? Like, why do we need HTTP specific methods at all?
Because like yeah,
Can I give it a try?
yeah.
Okay, so we have two flavors of buffering. One is kind of global to the process. The other one is more temporal in nature. So the HTTP request thing is basically, it gives us a convenience for service work, a convenience start and stop point for a bucket of state. So you can think of it as, okay, this request, this whole thing is stands alone, separate from all the other requests, separate from the other activities in the process. So that's why it's a extremely meaningful scope for a service, and that's why it's treated separately.
This is about HTTP client request or about ASP.NET incoming request?
So, this is incoming.
ASP.NET.
Right, so given a request that's incoming, you can buffer the logging state for that request independent of other requests, and then you can flush all the logging state associated with that request if necessary. So in particular, if everything goes great for a request, you dump the, you ignore this, throw away this data. If the request is going to return an error, then you want to log the data to figure out like, well, why did I fail?
How do I know this is about ASP.NET?
Is the name?
But specifically, which part of the name?
HTTP request. I guess we could use a different name if you want.
Just because I make HTTP requests with HTTP client.
Yeah, many servers are themselves clients to a later request.
But this will be like specifically HTTP request log buffering. This API will be in the package Microsoft ASP.NET Core Diagnostics middleware.
People don't see packages when they're looking at code.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
I mean, if someone like Stefan wants to tell me that I'm being overly cautious, then that's fine. But it strikes me as ambiguous.
Okay, sorry. So I've been going back and forth between a couple of things, but I heard the suggestion was add HTTP request log buffering, right? Which
We've moved on.
okay, sorry.
Sorry, I don't mean to keep nerd sniping you, but I see you here, so I'm gonna ask a question. So my question was, how do I? This is apparently specific to ASP.NET, but how do I know that?
In that
And-
system net, yeah.
Yeah, and so then my follow-up question was, am I being overly cautious?
Maybe not. Like we do expose some of the stuff via like the HTTP client factory, right? Like iLogging builder. I'm not, or I could see us doing that.
I mean, like if HTTP was replaced with incoming or preceded by incoming, maybe that would make it more clear. It at least tells you it's requests you're receiving as opposed to requests you're issuing. Don't everybody hate on it at once.
No, I like incoming. I was just trying to think of like alternatives. I'm also like scanning source.net to see all the places we expose logging.
Yeah, there's got to be similar things elsewhere in the framework. Right? Things that deal with headers, and there's headers on the receiving end versus sending end as well.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
I
it
mean, if this is
depends.
already, sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, like, it is contextual, right? Like, if it's on HTTP context, we're talking about the server's perspective. If it's on, a Kestrel server options, we're obviously talking about the server's perspective. But yeah, I mean, add incoming HTTP request log buffering doesn't seem too bad. I mean, it's long, but we're known for that.
No, so should we just go with that name then?
Fine by me.
All right,
Otherwise
so
it's
that's
long,
what
but
the way
sounds
we say.
fine.
Add incoming HTTP request log buffering.
I don't want to complicate things though. If there's already pattern, to your point, Martin, like we already have some ASP.NET specific things around requests and response handling. do we do anything special there? Or if not, like we could just say, oh, well, we're following precedent.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like there has to be some jurisprudence here somewhere.
So I don't want to get like too into the weeds with implementation, but how is this filtering out like just so-called request logs? Are these like just the host, the server, that like are all the logs getting buffered? Um, would this include like background services and stuff?
Yeah, so there's filtering criteria to say what goes into this request buffer, and you can specify an event ID or attributes and log level, and then that log record, that specific log record that matches these constraints is going to be associated with this request. It's going to be in the request buffer. When the request completes, that data is thrown out basically. If
And that's
the
assuming that there's like a parent request activity, right? Like, what if I didn't properly filter things and like it's including background service logs? Will those get filtered out automatically for not having an associated request activity, or what?
Yes, so the filter, the filters is applied just globally to whatever log record is produced. So you match these criteria, you're going into the per request buffer. So if there's some background thing that happens to match these things, it's going to go in there as well. So don't do that. Right, so you can lose the log categories. In particular, is probably the more likely thing. The log category is what determines what goes into the per request buffer.
I thought there was a bit of logic at some point that basically uses HTTP context accessor to check if there's a current, request in progress, and if not, there is also a global buffer hanging off this thing if there is no request in progress.
Yeah, there's also a global buffer, but I thought the matching was only, again, you just match a log record and say which buffer you're going to go into. Is that not what we implemented in the end?
Yeah, Evgeny?
Yeah, so if there is an active HTTP context or like IHTTP context accessor, then we buffer into this respective buffer, and we store it in scoped lifetime in DI. And when it is disposed, like yeah, it's gone. But like when at the time of buffering, if we see that there is no HTTP context, we buffer it into a global buffer.
So the matching happens first. There's only one matching. You match for buffering, and then after that you decide which buffer it goes into.
Yes,
Yeah, so
we match.
Okay.
Yeah.
okay. Because honestly, I'm almost tempted to go the other way. Sorry, Steve, but I'm just like, can we just call this add memory buffering? Because I do think the logging is implied. It's on an iLogging builder. It's not one of the types that we have like implemented in a bunch of places, or like it's not like web application where it's both the I application, builder and an I endpoint route builder or something. It's nothing like that. And I don't think we would do that. So I think the log is implied. I think kind of the HTTP request is implied. Like it could actually include system net kind of logs, right? If you had HTTP client factory, right? You can have logging for your outgoing requests that end up in here that will be associated with the incoming request. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like this could be buffering any number of types of logs. So like add memory buffering or something, add in memory buffering, which would be reasonable to me.
But
But maybe I'm missing some of what it does.
I mean, that seems just. What's the difference then between add memory buffering and add the global from? I guess you missed that part last week.
Yeah, that is the problem. I did just skim past that. So sorry.
I will say
I see. So
the
the
note that I
point
put
is that-
here is an alternate name from chat of if HTTP context is what represents the server and what we're actually talking about, what if we just replaced request with context? Then now it's obviously the incoming.
Yeah. Or yeah, could it be like associate logs with HTTP context? That's a terrible name. But yeah.
add HTTP context buffering. That's not quite right. Log buffering.
Buffer logs per HTTP context. It needs to start with add though.
Also, in case it's not apparent to you, Stefan, the buffer is a look back buffer that is mostly always going to be thrown in the garbage. It's just in case you want to do a look back and have additional context to associate with like an exception.
Okay.
So the buffer doesn't mean buffer and then send, it's buffer and lose.
I appreciate that. It wasn't entirely clear to me, so thanks.
I agree.
I thought we threw in the name circular somewhere last week to make this clear. Didn't we have that in one of the discussions?
There was a note that the name buffering has not meant anything to anybody who was part of this conversation other than the proposers. Circular was a suggestion, but it's not in the.
Okay.
It at least is not listed here in the proposal. So for these verbs,
I think it was just an idea, like which we did not decide on, like how to proceed there.
Incoming HP.
anyway, if we don't like this name, it's fine. I just doodled it here, so I had a reminder to bring it back up when the conversation stalled momentarily.
Add per HTTP context log buffering.
Oh, there's only so much you can encode in a name here.
I know.
I think this 43 character name is sufficiently descriptive. I don't know if it's 43.
I was thinking like per instead of like, I mean, that seems better than incoming HTTP request log buffering. Because it's like kind of keyed off of the HTTP context, right? These buffers, it allows you to look back for a given scope.
It just sounds weird to me to HTTP context is not something that inherently needs logging. It's the requests that are triggering the logging.
That's fair. Add per request log buffering.
For incoming request?
Um,
That's pretty clear. Add per incoming request log buffer.
I'm okay with that.
You didn't say HTTP, so I deleted it.
Yeah, we're trying to find out what we can remove.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in the future there's some other kind of request. It's like an event queue or something. I don't know. Maybe that's too forward looking.
You could replace log with circular.
I agree. I think log is pretty strongly implied on an all logging builder, and I don't think we would have a type that implements like logging builder and something else that interesting.
All right, so now with this symbol, you're implying that it's for incoming requests. It's doing circular buffering on the log state. The only thing it's not saying is HTTP, but that's kind of implied, I think.
And if you support event queue protocol, then you probably want that log too. And it's ASP.NET, so they'll call it HTTP context anyway.
Yeah.
What does circular buffering mean here?
So it's a buffer of a fixed size, you add stuff to it, and as you add more things, old stuff drops out. Right, so a classic circular buffer.
So I could wind up with a partial log if I have a very intense request that,
So the idea is this is kept in memory, and the 99% of the case, never gets sent to the server. It only gets sent to the server if a bad thing happens. Ooh, I want to see what happened in the last couple of seconds. Send it out. And this is typically paired with the other side of things, which says when something bad happens, not only do you dump out the last couple of seconds, but you turn off buffering for the next few seconds. So you get a window over the bad thing without logging all this crap all the time when things are going fine.
and when I log, when I decide that I want to log, do I log the log messages for the request, or do I log whatever's in my buffer, including requests that have happened prior to that?
I think in the case of the request one, it's scoped only to that request, right, Evgeny?
Yes.
Yeah, so that it's per HTTP request in this context. There's also a global buffer that's agnostic of the request.
Right. So it doesn't feel right to me to say that it's both circular and per request. I mean, what I think we want to say is like it's ephemeral, right? I'm logging something ephemerally, and I might choose to actually write it to stable storage later, but for the time being, I'm just logging it ephemerally.
So in implementation right now, is it actually for this a circular buffer?
Yeah, is it like a single circular buffer that all the requests are sharing and then it gets like filtered, or is it like a circular buffer per request? I'm kind of guessing it's the former, isn't it?
Yeah, it just per request. It just scoped to.
But is it circular or does it grow infinitely as more log data comes in?
It is circular, but yeah, it has some limit, some maximum size.
So it's circular per request. So another request logs isn't going to drown out like my request if it's doing something slow or whatever. Is that correct?
No, it is like separate circular buffer per each request.
Yeah, but they
Okay.
don't interfere.
So that seems right then, right, Mike? Like if there is a circular buffer per request, you could like lose some of the beginning logs of a given request if there's a ton of logs.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. If it really is circular, and it's also really per request, then I guess that's fine. It wasn't clear to me that that was the case, but if that's the case, then okay.
That was worth calling out because yeah, if it was like a global circular buffer and like a chatty neighbor could cause issues or whatever, it's definitely not implied by this name or anything.
Yeah, my concern was that circular was being used when a word like ephemeral was really intended. But if it's really circular, then okay.
But it is also ephemeral. So it's kind of both.
Yeah, hopefully the per incoming request implies some, ephemerality that, once the request is over, we're done.
Yeah, data's gone.
I mean, what's more important here to convey? Is it more important to convey that it's an ephemeral buffer that you have to actively do something to make it log, or is it more important to convey that it's circular?
Or neither. Like, honestly, both can maybe be explained in documentation, and you could just be like per incoming request.
Or right. I would agree with that too.
Well, so to me, the key differentiator here is, and which is misleading, it's not buffering in the sense of I'm just going to keep it in memory and send a batch later. Right? So this is typically we're keeping it in memory unless something bad happens, at which point we flush it. So it's not a performance thing.
Right. It's basically a late decision if you want to have basically like debug logs or something for this given request because some
Yeah.
circumstance.
Yeah,
Which
so
is
maybe the whole
interesting.
problem is the word buffering. Maybe that needs to be something else.
Yeah, the phrase from Chad is anomalous log region selector. Um, I
Clearly.
don't think we want to add all those words here, but I think that that actually describes the feature better than the word buffering. Just a thing for
Actually,
somebody to think about.
collector. I like the word collector. Right. I think
I don't
that's
mind it.
So, as a meta idea of saying log buffering is log collectors.
I don't know how you squeeze it into this phrasing because yeah, I don't think add per incoming request. Maybe log collecting, but yeah, it's like log collection. I mean, I
So
get
how
why
about
buffering was used because like it makes a little bit of sense. Sorry.
add anomalous event capture? No, we're not capturing the. It's the we flush the buffer when an anomalous event occurs. So we're keeping stuff in case something bad happens.
What if you just change buffering to buffer?
I like that. I do think that's better than buffering. Because buffering, yeah, implies that the flushing's going to happen regardless. But buffer, like, implies more that you decide what to do with the buffer.
That works. And maybe the solution is just 2 paragraphs of docs instead of trying to put it in the name.
Yeah, I like it without circular or ephemeral. Like my vote right now, I think is the add per incoming request log buffer.
This guy.
Still a mouthful, but it's one of the shorter ones. Yeah.
All right, should we commit to that for now and move on?
Yes, half hour. I think that's enough time.
All right.
Does that cause us to revisit the like add global buffering or anything that I wasn't here for?
I mean, that one still, it had the, we're not sure the name is good, so I think we do want to come back to that at some point, but we can finish the stuff we haven't looked at first.
For sure. All right.
Okay, so HTTP request log buffering options, but I guess we need to yeah, discuss its name again.
So how about we put a pin in the naming and focus on the functionality first?
Okay. So we have just like effectively one option is buffer size per each request, and then we have rules, which is we reviewed last week for global buffering as well. And yeah, I changed it from list or something to iList, and it uses getters and setters to support options, pattern, and configuration binding.
Okay, and so you've confirmed that the setters are required,
Yes,
even when you have a
for this
constructor, because this one doesn't have the constructor, but the other ones did in the.
constructor, yeah, like we don't have to have constructor. Well, like for options pattern, default parameter less constructor is required, but yeah, it is by default there.
those are in BOGO bytes, but it's consistent with the rest of the feature. So
So how does an application get its hands on the log buffer object? I guess you have an example there.
Yeah. So yes, as it was suggested last week, like to use abstract classes instead of interfaces for this feature as well. So I turned it into abstract class, HTTP request log buffer. So for HTTP request log buffering, users are supposed to inject it into the middleware, for example. So basically inject it using dependency injection and call this flush current request logs.
Okay, so they'll get
What?
a scoped buffer, basically.
Yes, and
What if I
log
call
buffer.
flush instead of flush current request logs on an HTTP request log buffer?
Yeah, log buffer is also abstract class, and it has flash method, I think. But we need to scroll up.
right, but the
Yeah.
question was, is that if you call flush, is that
Mhm.
flush everything?
No, flash only current requests.
But
Current
then,
So why
request
do we
logs.
need a new type? Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, why?
You could already call flush.
If you extended log buffer, you already have a method called flush.
Oh, it's like a marking thing. It's for DI, isn't it? So it's basically we need a new type for DI, but I don't know that we need a new method. Like so, one's the scope service and one's the singleton service, presumably. So the HTTP request log buffer would be a scope service, and the log buffer would be a singleton service. Do I have that right?
Yes, but I'm just double checking my implementation. But yeah, it should be that.
So that,
I mean, yeah, I don't think we need the new method if they do the same thing, but you could still have the derived type.
wait, I mean, I thought one of these things has a global flush and the other one has a current request log flush.
But
But
I
the-
mean, they just flush, right? Like none can do the other thing, so you don't
I
need
mean,
two methods on the
this
same object.
extends from log buffer, so both APIs are going to be present on the same type.
That's
Right,
the,
and that's
Your
the
question.
choice of two methods to call depending on which behavior you want.
Right, is flush
Oh.
supposed to be flush everything, or is it supposed to be an alias for flush current request logs?
But I don't understand. The log buffer is, we said, it's per request. So,
So there's a log buffer type, and that type has an API on it that
Called flush.
flushes. Basically, there's two operations that you can do when you are request logging. You can either flush your current request, or you can flush all global logs. And so, in theory, since there's two operations, you want two APIs that you invoke, depending on which operation you're trying to do. We can, argue all about the names of those APIs, but does it make sense that there should be two because there's two different
No.
operations?
No, I mean that is like I'm not talking about the names. So we have two types, right? We have log buffer and HTTP request log buffer, ignoring the names, right? One of them's
Sure.
a singleton and one of them's scoped. The scoped one derives from log buffer, which is the singleton thing. So assuming that I get the scope service, whatever we call it, but currently HTTP request log buffer,
Mhm.
if I call flush on that, does that A, like throw, B, like flush all the global logs, or C, like do the exact same thing flush current request logs does, or something else?
because
believe
I think that the
the-
name is misleading here for all these questions because this is called log buffer, no S, and so it implies it's a specific buffer, and it has a method to flush the current buffer and to flush some other buffer, the global one. Shouldn't you be asking for two separate things from DI?
Right. So one's a singleton, one's scoped, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the point. Like, yeah, you can have the different behaviors, right? Like if I resolve log buffer, that's the singleton I call flush. It flushes all the global buffers. If I resolve HTTP request log buffer, I call flush. It flushes just the logs for this request. Doesn't need to be a different name.
Right. So I think we want an extra type, global buffer, that derives from log buffer. And then, so that's what you get from DI, and then both of them just have a flush method.
That seems reasonable.
Well, log buffer is a global buffer already. I just renamed it.
I do like having that type hierarchy though, right? Where log buffer is never resolved directly from DI, and
Yeah.
you either just resolve a global log buffer or a incoming per whatever we call the scope one, right? And it's very clear if you call one global and one scoped or something like that. Then they just both derive from log buffer.
So what do you think, Evgeny? Is that compose well with the rest of the code?
So yeah, I'm not sure I'm following. So
So you make log buffer a base class, and then there you have two derived types: HTTP request log buffer and global log buffer. Those are the two things you get from DI. You never get the abstract class from DI.
but like, no, I mean, what is the problem with this? Like with this proposal, because this is like derived from log buffer. You can still call flush on it.
Yeah, so the problem is conceptual. It's called log buffer. So when I get that from DI, I expect it represents a single log buffer. But now it has two different flush methods to say flush this buffer or flush some other buffer, the global one. And that's odd. So that's why I would expect from DI I get my either the current local buffer that's scoped to my request, or I get the global one, and they're different, and I can flush one or flush the other. So
Okay.
or you rename you rename log buffer to be buffer control, and then you can flush the local buffer and flush the global buffer. But it can't just be called buffer.
To me, it seems fine if you just have log buffer and HTTP request log buffer, but this should not introduce a new method. It should just override. Its implementation of flush is just request flush the current context. Like
But
they're
that's the
both
thing, there's two different operations. We need to be able to flush the current request, and we need to be able to flush global.
off of this
No, that's
object.
the thing. So we're discussing how to best implement this, but there's two different functions that are necessary.
Oh, this is because of the DI. Go give me a thing, and if you ask if you have a base class and a derived type, it's going to give you the derived type when you wanted the base one. Because you wanted the
It
global
won't
one, and it had
give
no
you
specific
the
type.
derived type when you want the base one. It's DI what looks for an exact match. It doesn't do like ISA kind of checks. Or
But you don't. But you wouldn't have a good way without global and per request being different type keys. You wouldn't have a good way of saying which one you wanted.
right. So in my opinion, you can get either away with three types or two, kind of like you're saying. Either way, I think you only need the one flush method on the base type. I kind of prefer three because it's like very explicit about like the global one being global and not just the base type happens to be the global one. But yeah. I hope, yeah, DI makes it weird. I hope it follows. But the idea is like you could either say injecting a log buffer gives you the global log buffer, or we could say that we're going to create a new type called like global log buffer that derives from log buffer. Say you have to inject that to get the global log buffer. If you ask for just a plain log buffer, you're not going to get anything. It would be where I'm leaning.
Can you show the type log buffer, please? Okay. So it has flush. Okay, so an alternative is to just have two totally unrelated types. So global buffer and local buffer, and they're not related.
Yeah, but why not make them related? They have the same methods, right?
Yeah, I mean, it sounded like the proposal was take the current log buffer type, split it into a global log buffer and a base log buffer, and the flush method here would move to global log buffer.
Well, my proposal was really log buffer stays exactly as it is. You have two types that derive from it, global log buffer and per request log buffer, and neither of them actually add any members. Like they just
they both override flush.
Right, that's my preference at the moment.
That's fine by me. I think like the original design assumed different method names were picking the operations. Now we're saying different queries from DI will pick the operations. That seems fine.
Yeah, and to me, it's also about the identity. So I have a buffer and I can flush it, as opposed to I have a buffer and I can flush it, and I can flush this other buffer that's global somewhere.
Yeah,
I like having these strong objects.
Yeah, I'm happy with this DI suggestion.
Okay, so we're adding a currently proposed name is global log buffer extends log buffer.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Okay. And the HTTP request log buffer adds no unique members. I'm almost caught up. Because it's buffering. Okay. So, log buffer, it's two children. Okay. So we seem to have hit the end of the proposal, so I guess now we get to bike shed on buffering for the next 37 minutes. And I'll start at once.
One thing that I don't think we can do much about, but I just want to be clear, is I assume that when you flush the global log buffer, that's not flushing any of the per request buffers. It's just like a separate global buffer that gets flushed. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fine. I think the names are clear enough. I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly.
Should we start from the top again and just kind of review the whole thing as a unit now?
Sure. So this is taking all of the snippets and merging them into one block. So everything is grouped by namespace, not by associated functionality.
Yeah, but
I just
I was muted when I said this. So add trace-based sampler does not mention logging in the name. It's from a consistency with the other discussions we had. Like, should that be probabilistic log sampler?
I would say for consistency, if you have per incoming request log buffer, should it be just add global buffer?
Both of those suggestions sounded fine and seemed like they would increase consistency across these names.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I mean the log got inserted down here because an HTTP request is a thing that could be buffered. Um, uh, Once we get the HTTP out and it's add per incoming request, we could get rid of log, which I think got mentioned at one point, but we were done talking about the name, so.
So you say
Yeah, I
that
also
it's not
like it without log. Actually, it's on an iLogging builder.
for the on the sampler APIs, you mean?
Where is highlighted? But yeah, I mean that's like user very initial feedback, which is like.
Well, but we got rid
Gonna
of the
be
word
one.
HTTP, so now it doesn't read as
Yeah.
HTTP request buffer. It just says per incoming request buffer or log buffer, whichever one we want, and that at least doesn't feel like it's buffering outgoing HTTP requests through HTTP client.
Yeah, I'm okay with removing log there. I don't feel like super adamant about it, but I think it's going to be logging dot most of the time. Logging dot add per incoming request buffer.
Okay.
All right. So on line 28, do we want to add global buffer?
I was assuming yes.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay. And then on line 17, we don't need to put trace-based log sampler, probabilistic log sampler. Yeah, I guess not.
So, speaking of sampling API again, last week we got some feedback from OpenTelemetry folks. They are actually considering introducing probability or probabilistic sampling for traces. And their concern is that there might be naming collision with our API. And so my question is like, what is our view on it? Like, should we take that into account? Should we come up with some new name for it? Or we don't care?
Did Raj Kumar like reach out and talk to you more than just that one comment in the thread?
Yes, we did, and he's concerned that mainly about naming in future.
Okay. Did he have any suggestion of what he thinks a better alternative is?
Well, one suggestion is rate limiting sampler, but it like
That ours would be that?
sorry, could you repeat, please?
Is he suggesting that our name be rate limiting, or is he suggesting the open telemetry one be rate limiting?
Yeah, for our name, he's suggesting like to consider rate limiting sampler, but I don't think it is accurate because
I agree. That doesn't feel accurate because we're not rate limiting.
Yep.
So they want to add a function with the same name?
They have not decided yet, but they are debating, and they might want to add it later.
And did he say, did they want to add it on iLogging Builder, or they mean they're just going to add it someplace completely different?
Um, I don't know. I don't know if they have like any decision. They are working on tracing only. So like for logging, it's like it might come up in the future. So it's like not decided where and how.
All right. I encouraged him to reach out, and I was hoping that it would be more resolved. I don't feel like I know enough about his concern to make a decision, and I am hesitant to change this name at the very least. So I can try and follow up with him and see if I can get more clarity on it.
So what's on line 32 and 33 here? Are those?
Other names from chat.
Oh, okay.
Again, going with the global buffer. What does buffer mean? And it's the, well, this is not the kind of buffer that delays the number of times you get on the wire. It's the kind of buffer that deletes data. So it's if we're interested in evaluating a full alternative name concept
Ooh.
for the proposal.
How about anomalous log retention? Does that convey the message better?
I think so. You're storing something, but then later you're going to talk about the limits of what you're willing to store, and then you have the option of unstoring it and storing it somewhere else. Of course,
So
that probably wants to add global anomalous log retention, but
yeah, and then the other one is add per request anomalous log retention.
I mean, I like it because it describes the why you want it more than what it's doing. So it makes it clearer to a code reviewer what's going on.
So when I first read it, and I'm not vetoing it or anything, but the idea that popped in my head was that somehow we were deciding what was anomalous before we put it in the buffer, and then only the anomalous things got buffered, which is
It's the wrong
obviously
polarity.
not what we're doing. But that was the thought that came into my head when I read that name. So, if that's just me that's sort of interpreting it in a weird way, that's fine. Like, don't feel like you need to abandon it, but sharing what came to me.
Well, I had the same. When I said it, I had the same concern. Because it's not, we're not logging, we're not retaining anomalous logs. We're retaining logs in case of an anomaly.
Add verbose log retention, and maybe some people choose verbosity is determined by category instead of by just the log level.
Okay, here's another one. Add log retention for anomalies.
Do we have many APIs with 4 in the name? Honestly, I don't mind calling it an anomalous log buffer. Like, at first I was more against it, but I'm like, what else are you really using this for? I kind of get the point about the polarity being reversed, and that, like, most of the time that buffer is going to be filled with normal logs that never get flushed. But the purpose of the buffer is so you can flush the anomalous logs, which Yeah, I don't hate it. And then it makes it more obvious that the global and the per request buffers are similar conceptually.
Because using anomalous as a prefix means, the type that collects anonymous log, not anonymous, anomalous uh, logs is anomalous log buffer instead of log buffer for anomalous. Sorry, log buffer for anomalies. Um,
I think it's a little clumsy, but I like the 36 line 36.
okay, but then so what's the?
Then you'd have the add per request log retention for anomalies.
Or if you really want to extend it, not that I love it, per incoming request.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So then you have
But,
those.
Well, the type doesn't need to be called for anomalies, right? It's just a buffer of logs.
Fair enough.
yeah,
I'm just
I like the type names.
just seeing where we're going with
Honestly,
the naming theme.
Yeah.
So
I see the argument that it is more clear that the log for anomalies or log retention for anomalies, but I don't know. Anomalous log buffer, I think,
Snappier.
sounds less stilted, but anomalous is also kind of a weird word. Maybe more people will pick up on anomalies than anomalous. I don't know.
So who decides what's an anomaly here? The the
It's
The
the
app
application.
developer.
Yeah, the app developer ultimately.
yeah, the developer, right? So
when they call flush, they have decided an anomaly happened and they want the look back view.
right. I mean, I worry that when we put anomalies or anomalous in these names, that it somehow conveys that there's some definition of them, when there really isn't a definition. It's just whatever the developer decides to log.
Yeah, I mean the definition of what to capture is whatever the last argument says to capture. So
Okay, so I think the word retention is what saves it here. You could just say add log retention, add global log retention, and add per request log retention. That's it.
I like that.
Yeah, honestly.
I'll throw
Yeah,
out yet
I'm
one
okay with
more
that.
small variation to that. Instead of retention, you might use recorder in the same term as like flight recorder that records flight data if something were to go bad.
There's a difference. Is recording doesn't imply it's kept. Right? You could record and still send out.
I wonder if any county recorders would disagree with you on that.
I get what
well.
your point. I get what you're saying now. At first, I didn't. Like, I'm like, well, of course it's being kept, but yeah, you're saying that it might be kept and passed through,
Yeah.
and it's.
I recorded the
not.
fact this happened.
Yeah.
I like retention.
So
I'm fine with retention. I wanted to put the option out there, but
Yeah.
I'm fine with retention.
I'll just
And to be clear, some of these logs could be passed through, right? They're like different filters, so like, I mean, it just depends on how it's configured, right?
the question with that I would have with retention is, does somebody think that's related to compliance with saying these kind of traces need to be kept for 20 years?
I don't hate recorder. It would almost make us want to change the log buffer type to like log recorder, which isn't even bad.
Sure. I mean, once we figure out a name here, I think it's going to cascade through everything else. So.
Yeah. I like recorder better than retention, I think, slightly. Both are good, though.
Okay, I think given the compliance related implications of retention, then yeah, maybe recorder is a better choice. Yeah.
And we've gone through so many names. And they're very different. We had buffering, then buffer, then
Yeah.
anomalous log retention.
Well, because I mean, I feel like the idea behind once you turn this on is you do need to go change your logging mentality because you're gonna set your core logging level to be lower than before, probably maybe, but then you're gonna say these kinds of things need to be always sent live and these kinds of things need to be held back, and so somewhere in there you now need to talk about how you're splitting your per category and
Yeah.
log level settings between live logs and conditional logs.
I think it's interesting that when developers first think about sampling and buffering their logs in this way, they're afraid they're going to lose the ability to diagnose problems because there's less logging state. I think the actual opposite happens when buffering is involved. In your code, you can be more aggressive in what you log. You can log more stuff without blowing the budget because you know that this whatever you log is only going to make it over there when there's a problem.
It also seems useful for like if you get a memory dump potentially, if you're allowed to like do such a thing. One thing I like about buffer though over both recorder and retention is it does imply that it's ephemeral. Once you get into like recorder and retention, it seems like the default isn't to throw it away, right? But it totally is.
So log recorder with a limit of a memory limit.
From last week, I think Noah mentioned tail sampling, which seems to be also some kind of industry standard. So maybe that's, I don't know, that's also an option.
Add global log tail sampling.
Tail sampler.
Yeah, I mean, it is a term that accurately describes what this thing is doing. I think the only concern is it may not be a term that's broadly known outside of people that do telemetry a fair amount. But as a quick poll, I wouldn't be like, I don't know how many people in our little group right here knew what tail sampling was prior to me saying tail sampling, if we think of, this group of folks as being a representative set of developers.
Yeah, without all this conversation beforehand, I wouldn't have known. Like, now that we're in it, then yeah.
And I know what it is, but every time I hear it, I have to pause for a few seconds and play it back in my head.
Right. So I wouldn't be surprised if 50+% of app developers who saw that term in their code would just be like, huh, what's that?
But what I do like about sampler is that it implies that logs are dropped in a way retention and recorder does not, like most of the time.
Honestly, I like buffer the best.
Me too, honestly. I'm coming back to it.
With or without anomalous?
Without, because again, anomalous is basically what the developer decides it's going to be. So
right,
Okay,
it might
so-
not
so
even
it's
be
just-
anomalies. They might do their own like weird probabilistic sampling or something with that. Like, so it'd be weird.
Okay, so you got add global log buffer and add per incoming request log buffer. And the buffers are circular in nature, that's you read in the docs to figure that out. And then you can flush either by getting a global buffer or a per incoming request buffer from DI.
Seems fine.
Yeah.
Fine by me. I think when you said it, Martin, you included log buffer in the name, but I assume we're going to stick with the name that does not have the word log because we decided logging was implied.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. Lots of minutia.
All right. Where'd we land?
So add global buffer as is, and add per incoming request buffer as is.
Okay.
And in the discussion, there's no anomaly, has nothing to do with it. It's a general purpose mechanism that happens to be used for anomaly stuff.
Okay.
Man, chat's really getting on board with tail sampling. I read the YouTube chat. It's like I agree that it's not the most intuitive, but once you hear it, it's pretty precise. But yeah, I like the current name. Let's move forward.
Okay. So, do we have anything else for Microsoft Extensions logging namespace? Certainly, if you're having a kerfuffle with OpenTelemetry, you can hold back your probabilistic samplers, and if you need to come back with a name change, that should be hopefully straightforward. But
Is the per incoming request log buffer called that? Is that what we called it? If you scroll down, I think.
you mean here?
No, the type. So we have the global log buffer, and what's
yeah,
the
yeah.
per request?
That's when we get down to those other namespaces. I'm asking, can I
sorry.
scroll?
Oh, I think you can scroll. Yeah.
All right. So for sampling, the only thing I see is the options in the rule. I did see some inconsistency of in a few places you're calling things iList, and in one you called them list. Like in one place there was a pragma suppress that says I want to use list here because I want add range. I just don't know why you're not the same on all of them.
Yeah, that was fixed. So it is iList everywhere.
Okay, maybe that was me looking at the old stuff. All right, so for the probabilistic sampler, everybody's still happy with what's here.
And probability is 0 to 1.
Yes. Well, of course, yeah. In my implementation, I will add validation, but yeah, I think it will not be public API, so that's why it's not here.
What does ilog sampling filter rule implement or define?
It is in internal interface. Just to so I have also internal filter rule selector class, which is kind of logic to select the best rule.
Yeah.
And I use it for both buffering and sampling.
Okay.
And yeah, it is based on the interface.
Yep. If it's not a public interface, it doesn't matter. So I
Yeah.
deleted it. All right. So now we get lots of buffer versus buffer-ings. So the
Okay, so that should
namespace
just
with
that
an
should
ing
just be
seems
global.
fine.
That should just be global buffer options then. I think. Oh, and the name, yeah, the name of that class on line 27.
No, yeah. Okay. So how do we feel about the options type and the extension type?
Okay, so the line 27 should just be global buffer logging builder extensions, I think. And then line 34 should be per incoming request logger builder extensions. Yeah,
Yeah, the log is ing because logging builder is the.
yeah. Okay.
Okay. Are we global log buffering options, global log buffer options? I feel like the type is still proposed as global log buffer, so I wouldn't get rid of the log here because you're really giving the options for that log instance. Sorry, for the log buffer instance.
Well, that work. Okay.
But we can get, if the ing is off the type, then it probably makes sense to drop the ing here as well. Or we can leave the ing as they're related to the concept more than the type. I don't know what the convention in this area is.
Well, shouldn't it just be global buffer options? That's kind of the convention we've had elsewhere in the.
Well, it's a are they matching the name of the type that they're eventually going to be associated with, or are you matching them to the verb that they're bound on? Because I don't think we want to call this just global buffer, because
That's kind of generic.
that's a very, very overreaching type name. So I think log wants to still be in this type. So log being in this type makes sense to me, and then I just don't know if it's buffering or buffer.
Well, the type is going to be buffer, so I'd probably just nuke the ing. Well, these are options controlling the buffering activity. The buffer is just how the data is externalized. So I guess I would leave it ing then.
Okay. So global log buffering options, log buffering filter rule. And then the I'll move this up so the other three are together. And then the HTTP request log buffering options, which I don't know if we want to rename that as per request log buffering options.
You should.
All right, Laszlo, 10 points to Gryffindor for buffer ring, and then minus 100 because it would be a terrible name to type.
Why does the global buffering options have a max record size and not the per request?
So why does global buffering options have max log record size?
Yeah, why the difference between the two options there?
Should the per request one have the same option, or is it intentional that it will keep any individual message up to the maximum buffer size?
Yeah, so this is yeah, this applies for all log records.
Oh, wow, that's surprising. So the global options affect the per request options, but only for the max record size.
Yes.
Wait, what?
Can we just add it to the per request and just make those separate values?
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, as is, it would be awkward. You'd have to add HTTP request buffering, but then you would also have to independently inject a global global log buffering options. Yeah, I think that'd be weird.
And is there a suspend after flush duration? The other one?
Yeah, can someone explain what that is? Sorry.
So this is this window thing. When a bad thing happens, you flushed what's been retained in memory, and you want to say, for the next few seconds, also just send it out. Don't keep it. So you have a full window of the last 5 seconds and the next 5 seconds, or whatever the number is, around the bad thing.
Got it. So I can do this in the middle of a request and still get the logs from like the rest of the request in theory, or after the event. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, if you're progressing and there's a continuous stream of errors, then you're always going to be in this mode, basically. So if shit happens and it stays bad, the logging is just going to happen. No retention at that point.
Right, because
I know
if an error happens every 30 seconds, you're going to keep slamming on the...
Yeah, flush it. So it's always going to be sending out the data.
Yeah, so I copied it just so they would match, but I'll ask the question: Does the suspend duration make sense on the per request options? Like, requests are themselves pretty transient. It seems like if something happens in the middle that's an error, maybe you should just leave it as full transmit instead of
for the entire life of the request.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I agree with that. You could have some like WebSocket or something where it's not affecting the request per se, but it's affecting.
For WebSocket, would it be considered one request for the full life of the socket?
It would be, yeah.
Okay.
Same with like server send events and things like that. Though that's usually only outgoing.
Okay, so you could set suspend after flush duration to be infinite, and then you'd get the behavior you just described there, right?
Mm-hmm. But only globally, right? You can't do that like per flush or something, which would be interesting. Like it's more powerful perhaps to make that like a parameter to flush and more obvious. Like, because honestly, if I was just like reading through the API and stuff and I saw suspend after flush duration, I would probably just hope that doesn't matter and not realize what's going on. And that the things after I call flush are now being flushed. It's like a very interesting behavior. I see utility, but
so have the time value specified at the point of flushing.
Right, that makes it very clear that that's the behavior of flush.
I mean, you could have the options for if you called the one that didn't take it, but...
Right, yeah, you could have a default, which, yeah, even better, I guess. Certainly the most.
So, whether it be two things or just move it to the flush.
Okay, so the convenient part about doing it in the config is that it's explicitly in the config. So if the service is running, you can change this dynamically, and it'll do the right thing. If it's a little deeper into the code, you can still get it from config, but it requires a little more plumbing from the application standpoint to make sure somebody just doesn't put just 5 seconds in the code. So that's the main difference. I guess I'm suggesting that we keep it here, and then we could add a flush overload that takes a value that overrides this if we want.
Yeah, in a way, I almost wonder, is delay a better word than suspend? Because I kind of get what you're saying. It's like, oh, you're suspending the buffering, and now it's going directly out to the logs. But like, normally, if I just suspended the buffering, the logs wouldn't go anywhere, right? Like, if I'm suspending, I would almost expect things after that aren't going to get logged after, like things aren't going to get logged after flush. Or if
Yeah,
you
so
say
this
like
is
delay flush,
well, this is suspending the buffering.
yeah, I kind of get it, but it still seems confusing.
So we could say prevent buffering after flush.
But what's interesting about it isn't so much that you're preventing buffering, it's that you're flushing things after the call to flush.
Yeah. Okay.
You might just say flush duration. Just pretend flush is a very long operation.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost better. Then people might think flush blocks. That would be the only downside.
Sure.
But yeah, background flush duration. I actually kind of like
Yeah.
that.
Or
Right.
automatic flush, perhaps. So it's
Yeah, I mean-
logically after you issue the flush request, it's going to do automatic flushing for the next 5 seconds.
That's the clearest one to me.
Okay, and then for automatic flush, Stream Writer has already used auto flush, so we can say auto flush duration.
Sure.
So do we want the parameter version?
Yeah.
Do we want abstract, template, method, pattern? One of these calls the other. Like,
You know,
So just
we could always add the. Could we always add the one that takes a parameter later if we were?
it's more complicated to add that one later than the defaulting one
Yeah.
later, but you could.
It's just annoying. That's
Like-
fair.
Because this one could easily be, well, I don't know how it's supposed to have gotten its options, but if this somehow gets its options, then I guess yeah, you'd have to change the shape of it to show that options were always presented for it to do an automatic behavior.
yeah, for the sake of actually shipping this sooner, I'd rather not add the API right now because that means now it needs to be specific per request tracking of how long it's going to take, and it's just logic we don't have right now.
Fair enough. Like it's more complicated to add the version with parameters later because you can't add an abstract after you ship, and it would then either need to throw or like make ignore the duration, which feels surprising. So it doesn't have to be decided in this meeting, but it is harder to add it after V1.
That's true.
So maybe it's a thing to think about. For HTTP request log buffering options, do we want to replace HTTP with per, which I think matched the method? Or do we want
Sense.
it, and then down here, the HTTP request log buffer, do we want that to be per?
I assume so.
Okay. All right. In the notes.
So is it per request or per incoming request in the type?
The
Because extensions have incoming.
mean, I don't think that the type and the method here have to be the exact same. The method, I think, if the method wants the incoming to say that it adds clarity as the verb, the type is just describing that this buffer is attached to a request. The verb attached it to incoming requests. I don't think that's inconsistent. Chat asks, should per request buffer just be renamed to scoped lifetime buffer? Is it going to have any? Is the type, the class as presented there, going to have any logic that attaches it to like HTTP context or what have you? Or is it just the current DI scope?
But HTTP context is scoped, so it will use the same scoped lifetime. But what I mean is, mm, I'm not sure if you should add scoped because it feels like more implementation detail.
Yeah, I kind of get the argument about like, well, maybe this could be used if I created my own host that creates its own scopes for events or something. But
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you would
that
change.
risks losing clarity.
Yeah, I don't think you would change
Sorry.
the name here. Personally, I would like. I think that the verb we decided was good. It's just a question of, does it give you, instead of a per request log buffer, just a scoped log buffer?
I mean, if we did that, then we'd probably change global to singleton too, which isn't terrible, but I think I prefer
Okay.
what we have. Yeah, as far as like the per incoming request log buffer versus per request log buffer, sure. Like it's still only incoming, but I think that's also what they were trying to deal with is like scoped gets kind of out of the ambiguity of like, is it a client request or a server request? I think it's good though. If you're injecting a per request log buffer, I think it should be obvious that it's incoming.
Yeah, and it could have some outgoing log buffering. Just then that you're
Right, it's
configuring a
just
different
not
policy. So
right, but it's not per outgoing request. But exactly,
Right.
it could contain.
That's why I
lots
said
of
I think that it's good for the verb to give clarity on
Yeah.
what it's doing, but I don't think that the type needs to re-encode that as part of its noun.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
All right, and going back to the scoped versus per request, Chad asks, but wouldn't the per requests make sense in a console application that has no notion of a request, but does have a concept of scopes? And if you want to say that's niche and they get to use the name wrong, then sure.
It's attached. We're building infrastructure, so it's attached to HTTP requests. I guess it could be used in other situations as well, but that's not the design intent.
Yeah, I don't hate add per scope buffer. I don't hate it, but yeah, it's fair.
All right, I think we're happy enough with these, and if you change your mind on any of the other names, we can always entertain that. Because we're over, and I slightly promised my wife that we wouldn't be. So, so is there anything else? Going once, twice. Sold.
right. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you,
Thank you.
guys.
Thanks all.
And we cleared the things marked as blocking, and next week we'll get on the rest of these things. So, thanks everyone for joining us. We definitely had a lot of lively communication today, and I hope I effectively relayed everything. And so we'll see you next week, same .NET time, same .NET channel. Until then, auf Wiedersehen.